I, John Matthews of Culpeper County, being in perfect health, but considering that life is uncertain, and wishing to settle my temporal affairs, do make and ordain this, my last will and testament, in manner following, namely, it is my will and desire that all my debts be paid. Second, I give and bequeath to my daughter Nancy Shackelford, alias Nancy Matthews, that tract of land which I purchased of Zachariah Delancey, or at least a part of it, lying on the south side of the road heading to Lawson's Mill, containing 140 acres, being now occupied by Mrs. Freeman. Also 100 pounds cash, which I give to her heirs and assignees forever. But in case my said daughter should die without any child, then in that case it is my will and desire that the said land be equally divided between my other two daughters, Polly and Caty Shackelford, alias Polly and Caty Matthews, or to her child or children surviving, and to their heirs. Third, I give to my daughter Polly Shackelford, alias Polly Matthews, that tract of land which I purchased of William Coons, containing 175 acres. But in case she should depart this life, leaving no child, then I give and bequeath the said land to be equally divided between her two sisters or those surviving. Fourth, I give and bequeath to my daughter Caty Shackelford, alias Caty Matthews, the tract of land whereupon I now live, being all the land which I hold on the north side of the road leading to Lawson's Mill, which land I purchased of Aquila and Elisha Matthews and Zachariah Delaney. But in case she should die, leaving no child, it is my will and desire that the said land be equally divided between my surviving children or their representatives. Fifth, all the rest of my estate I give to my three said daughters, to be equally divided amongst them. But in case of either of them should die, leaving no child, it is my will and desire that their part be equally divided, or go to the surviving child or children, or their representatives. I do appoint my friends John Wigington, Thomas Spillman, and Captain Samuel Reed executors to this my last will and testament, in testimony whereof I have herewith set my hand and seal this day, 19th of June, 180, and the last year is obscured. Signed, John Matthews, with his mark. Culpeper County, Virginia, is in the indigenous territory of the Manahoic. I'm Jen Glavius, and this is the Hellenike Deep Dive, a podcast about the process of mapping and analysis for historical and archaeological research using open source tools. In this episode, I'm taking a bit of a detour to discuss a court case regarding the land distributed in the will I just read that involved William Frank Shackelford's father, aunts and uncles, grandmother, and many other relatives. The court case provides a wealth of information about the Shackelford family in the late 1700s and early 1800s in Culpeper County, Virginia. Let's dive in. In April 1855, Caleb Shackelford and James and Frances McDaniel filed a bill of complaint in Chancery Court against Benjamin Matthews, Sarah McDaniel, Elizabeth Shackelford, and others about the 3 tracts of land in Culpeper County, Virginia, given by John Matthews to his daughters Nancy, Polly, and Caty in his will after his death in 1809. This case would involve 4 generations of the Shackelford family and pit siblings against each other in court. Here's the case as I understand it at this point. John Matthews' will divvied up his land between his 3 illegitimate daughters, whose mother was a widow named Molly Shackelford. Molly also had 2 legitimate children from her husband, and these children were named John and Elizabeth Shackelford. John Matthews' will stated that each daughter of his was given a specific tract of land, but in the event that that daughter died without a child, then the land was to be divided up between the surviving daughters or their children. And this was to prevent anyone who was not a descendant of John Matthews from inheriting the land. So a husband who was married to one of the daughters, but they didn't have any children, that husband would not actually inherit the land. Only children or the remaining sisters. So John Matthews passed away in 1809, and his daughters did not survive him by even a decade. Nancy passed away not long after her father. She was unmarried and without children. So her land was to be divided between Polly and Caty. Polly married a man named Edward Wiley, but she died without any living children, and not long after Nancy had passed, her sister. And this left Caty as the heir to all the tracts of land from John Matthews. Caty, meanwhile, had married a man named Martin Button in 1812, and they had a child named John W. Button. In 1813, Martin signed the 175 acres given to Polly, originally in the will. He signed that land over to Polly's widower, Edward Wiley. But Caty had not actually endorsed that signing away of the land. And then Caty died around 1815. So at that time, Martin Button became entitled to live on the estate as a tenant for his life as a courtesy. And Caty and Martin's son, John Button, who was the heir to all the land, well, he died not long after his mother and long before reaching adulthood. And so the land was then to be passed on to his mother's relations. This meant that although John Matthews had tried to keep the land among his descendants, there weren't any left. And the land passed out of his family to Molly Shackelford's legitimate children, who were half siblings to Nancy, Polly, and Caty. But complicating this issue was that Martin Button, who had use of the land as a tenant for his lifetime, he instead treated the land as if he was the full owner. So by 1815, all three daughters of John Matthews and Molly Shackelford had passed away. Still living at that time were Molly Shackelford, her legitimate daughter Elizabeth, and the children of Molly's legitimate son, John Shackelford. Elizabeth had an illegitimate son named William Shackelford, then had married a man named Nathaniel Dorries, with whom she had 3 children. Elizabeth later married Alexander Wishart, and so I refer to her from now on as Elizabeth Wishart, because there are way too many Elizabeths in this story otherwise. John Shackelford, son of Molly, had married a woman named, you might guess it, Elizabeth, and his wife Elizabeth is the one I'm referring to when I say Elizabeth Shackelford going forward, even though his sister's name was also originally Elizabeth Shackelford. John and Elizabeth had 5 children. Sarah, who was one of the defendants in the case, was born in 1798. Theophilos was born in 1799. Morgan, the father of William Franklin Shackelford, Ruth's husband, had been born in 1800. Caleb, one of the plaintiffs in the case, was born in 1802, and Frances, another of the plaintiffs, was born in 1805 after the death of her father John. So at the time of the death of John Button, so Caty's son, who passed away in 1815, the heirs to the land would have been Elizabeth Wishart and the 5 children of John Shackelford. But keep in mind that at this point, Polly's share had been signed over to her widower, Edward Wiley, in 1814. And Caty's share was held by her husband, Martin Button. And both Wiley and Button would treat the land they held as if they owned it. And this is where it starts to get really complicated. Polly's widower, Edward Wiley, remarried a woman named Sarah Shackelford. This Sarah Shackelford, in fact, was the daughter of John and Elizabeth Shackelford, and thus Polly's niece, who was one of the inheritors of the land. Edward Wiley, however, died soon after in 1816, and he left the land in his will to Sarah Shackelford Wiley, even though the land legally was only deeded to him for Martin Button's lifetime. Sarah remarried a man named Ephraim McDaniel, and from this point forward, I'll be referring to her as Sarah McDaniel. And I just want to take a brief aside to talk about the names McDaniel and McDonald in the 1800s. Namely, I would see references to Sarah McDonald or Sarah McDaniel, and it were these different people. I learned, and maybe this is new information to you, that due to the pronunciation of the name, it could be written as either McDaniel or McDonald. And so it often was. So the same person in one census might be called Ephraim McDonald, and the next one who would be called Ephraim McDaniel. And this, of course, confused me a lot at first until I figured out what was going on. So, in this case, Ephraim and Sarah are listed as either McDaniel or McDonald, or sometimes both. Sometimes it says this one alias the other. But I will be calling them McDaniel, since that was the name that is used for them the majority of the time. All right, back to the case. In 1816, Sarah Shackelford Wiley was holding the tract of land originally given to Polly. Sarah would continue to claim the land as her own because it had been signed over to her first husband by Martin Button, but she really only owned a share of the land as the heir of John Button, Caty's son. In 1820, Sarah married Ephraim McDaniel. Meanwhile, according to her testimony in this case, Sarah McDaniel had taken in her grandmother, Molly Shackelford, who had been left nothing in John Matthews' will, even though giving birth to his 3 daughters. Sarah also took in her mother, Elizabeth Shackelford, and her younger siblings, Theophilus, Morgan, Caleb, and Francis. At this point, Theophilus, Morgan, Caleb, and Francis were all also heirs to the land along with Sarah, so they had equal shares. In 1821, Martin Button signed over Nancy's land, so tract of land. It was about 140 acres, and he signed it over to a man named Daniel Ward, who a couple years later signed the land over to a man named Benjamin Matthews, one of the defendants in the case. I have no idea if Benjamin Matthews was somehow a relative of John Matthews or not, since the family records are sparse, to say the least. What I do know is that Benjamin, except for 6 months in 1835-1836, he would hold on to that land until the case was brought to court in 1855. In 1824, Theophilus Shackelford, the eldest son in the family, so the younger sibling to Sarah, he died. And he left as his heirs his siblings, his 4 siblings, and his mother, Elizabeth Shackelford. Now this changed the proportions of the land that Theophilus's siblings were entitled to, dividing his share into 5 pieces, 1 for each of his siblings and 1 for his mother. And this gave Elizabeth Shackelford a share for the first time, but it was a very, very small share of the land. And she continued to live with her daughter Sarah on the tract of land that had originally been given to Polly from this time forward. In 1825, Martin Button, still treating the land as his own, signed 20 acres of the land given to Caty over to Morgan Shackelford, who was then the oldest brother in the family after the death of Theophilus. Martin Button then in 1827, so 2 years later, signed 185 acres over to William Freeman Jr. But a decade later in 1837, this man, William Freeman Jr., then signed 100 out of the 185 acres of that land over to Morgan Shackelford. So William Freeman Jr. had 85 acres still, and Morgan at this point, by 1837, has 120 acres. And this is by 1840, so checking in about 1840, when the other legitimate child of Molly Shackelford, Elizabeth Weishart, died, living in the West. So one of the tracts of land is held by Sarah McDaniel. Another by Morgan, most of it's held by Morgan Shackelford, and the last one is held by Benjamin Matthews. But ownership of this land should have been divided between the 4 surviving children of John Shackelford and Elizabeth Weishart's children, with a very small share going to Elizabeth Shackelford, John's widow, via her son Theophilus. Complicated, many teeny tiny shares. 2 years later, in 1842, Morgan Shackelford and his wife Jane signed over the land they held to Benjamin Matthews, who already had a tract of land. And that gave Benjamin Matthews all of the land willed by John Matthews, except for the tract held by Sarah McDaniel and the 85 acres that Freeman had. Shortly after this, Morgan and Jane moved their family, including William Franklin Shackelford, Ruth's husband, from Culpeper County, Virginia, where all this was taking place, to Missouri. And basically, Morgan and his family exits from this story. Now, this left Sarah McDaniel, who was widowed in 1844 when her husband Ephraim died. Also, Caleb Shackelford, who, coincidentally or not, had married one of Ephraim's younger sisters named Mary Louisa, and their youngest sibling, Francis Shackelford, who had married a man named James McDaniel in 1827. It seems this James McDaniel was not a sibling of Ephraim or Mary Louisa, and I can't find any other relationship between this James McDaniels and other McDaniels in our story, but the fact that all three married into various McDaniels families is just another element that adds confusion to this story, in addition to all of the various Johns and Elizabeths that we have. Now, the state of affairs continued for over a decade until 1854, when Martin Button passed away. And this ended Martin Button's use of John Matthews' land through his first wife, Caty. Caleb Shackelford and James and Frances McDaniel brought the case against Benjamin Matthews, Sarah McDaniel, Elizabeth Shackelford, and others in April 1855, asking that the over 400 acres of land from John Matthews' will in 1810 be equitably divided by the heirs. Morgan Shackelford was originally one of the defendants, but he had passed away in Missouri shortly after the case had been started. Sarah McDaniel, in her response to the bill of complaint, explained that she had inherited the land from her marriage to Edward Wiley. Sarah also tried to use the fact that she had taken in her grandmother Molly, as well as her mother Elizabeth and her younger siblings, including Caleb and Frances, who had brought this suit against her as plaintiffs. And so she's like, I took them in, I also helped support them, and this is my tract of land, I should just keep it. Benjamin Matthews, in his response to the bill of complaint, said that he had purchased the land in the understanding that it was to be his own, and without the stipulation that it was only for the lifetime of Martin Button. So that wasn't something that was anywhere, but it was based on the fact of the way that John Matthews had written his will, that the land would not go to a husband, but only to the child of a daughter. In 1856, the judge in the case ruled that the land held by Samuel McDaniel and half the land held by Benjamin Matthews had to be sold at auction, with the proceeds divided between the heirs in the proper proportions, and leaving out Morgan Shackelford's children because Morgan had signed away his share through selling the land to Benjamin Matthews. The purchasers of the two tracts of land in 1858 were Sarah McDaniel, who bought back the land that she had held, had lived on for almost 50 years at that point, and a Benjamin Shackelford, who bought the half of land Benjamin Matthews had held but had to sell at auction. Now, I have no idea if this Benjamin Shackelford was any close relation to the other Shackelfords in the story, namely because there was at least one other Shackelford family living in Culpeper County, Virginia at that time, including an attorney named John Shackelford, which makes me wish they had not reused the same names, John and Elizabeth, so much, because it gets super complicated. But there's another John Shackelford if you ever look through court records, and it's probably the attorney, who is not a close relation to Frank Shackelford's family. So, land sold at auction in 1858, but the case dragged on until November 1860, which was the last date of a decree of paperwork in the court case. So by 1860, Elizabeth Shackelford, the mother of Caleb, Morgan, Sarah, and Francis, had passed away 2 years earlier. Benjamin Matthews, who was also a defendant in the case along with Elizabeth, he had passed away in 1859. In addition, Caleb Shackleford, one of the plaintiffs, had moved west to Nicholas, Virginia, and moved in 1858 or so, or definitely by 1860. And that finally ends the case, as far as I know. The land that was sold at auction was not paid for with cash in full, but there were commissioners that bonded that the payments would be made by Sarah McDaniel and by Benjamin Shackelford, but they were able to pay on installment plans. And these plans would have taken them into 1861, 1862, possibly 1863, during which time this area was heavily embroiled. This was Culpeper Counties in Northern Virginia, and it was definitely embroiled in the battles of the Civil War. So I don't actually know if those payments were made. I don't know if they were dispersed. I don't know how the court systems functioned at that time, or if they function basically the same. I'm really curious about that, actually. But what information do we now have about the Shackelfords from this case? So this is a case from a chancery court, which has a bill of complaints, and then any defendants can respond. And so there's usually a lot of information from there, from affidavits and different depositions that are given. And that's definitely the case. That's definitely what we get in this case. And so we have a lot of information about the Shackelfords. And so we know that William Franklin Shackelford's great-grandmother, Molly Shackelford, we know about her second family of John Matthews, who she never married. We don't know when Molly moved in with John Matthews, although it was probably sometime in the 1780s, based on the fact that the youngest daughter, Caty, was born in 1791. Very, very frustratingly, we also don't know the name of Molly's husband, even though he's mentioned in a couple of the documents. Instead, there's a space left to fill in his name in both of these documents, but nothing. And I'm like, had they forgotten his name? What is this? Why didn't they put in his name? Why didn't they know his name at this point? Okay, back to what we actually do know. We learn that John Shackelford, so William's grandfather, passed away in 1805. And then afterwards, John's wife, Elizabeth, and their children first moved in with Elizabeth's father, who also is not mentioned. He's not named, just mentioned that they moved in with him. So don't know for certain who this person was, and it would have been nice, but I'm assuming he was someone local. So we know that they moved in with Elizabeth's father, but later moved in with Sarah, the eldest daughter, once she married Edward Wiley and she has a household. And Elizabeth would live with Sarah for the rest of her life. Morgan, who was the eldest son in the family, after the death of Theophilus in 1824, he had some power over some of the inherited land, but he had signed it over in 1842, and this was possibly to raise funds for the move to Missouri. I don't know if that's really what it was for, or if it was to pay some debts, but Morgan had some money and had some property from the records in Missouri, and I'll talk about that in the next episode when I talk more about William Franklin's family. We also learned that there was enough of a rift in the generation of Shackelfords before Frank and Ruth's generation that siblings were taking each other to court. And so that's why I took a detour from just discussing William Franklin Shackelford and his family to put his time into more context to talk about this one super complicated legal case that shows the complexities of the Shackelford family and of land that was partially, that came into their family, but then wasn't. As for work updates, I haven't made any progress on mapping. I have a couple other projects I'm working on that are taking up my time. I also spend a lot of time transcribing these court documents, which have typical 1800s handwriting. Some of them are more legible than others. Some of them, they look like lines with little scribbles. Some of them are very legible, but I spent time transcribing the ones I could, and that took a lot of my time last week. Also, something I had to learn was that in like mid 1800s, they would often write anything that had a double S. It would be written as if it was a fancy F. And so words that, if you're ever reading something like this, if a word looks like it's something that should have two S's and instead has an F, that's what's going on. That's their shortcut for writing that. All right, let's do some ed notes. This 1855 case of Shackleford and others versus Matthew and others, with all of its documents scanned as PDFs, is available online through the Virginia Memory Project at the Library of Virginia, and a link to the case is in the show notes. The documents are not really in any special order, and there's actually a couple documents from another case that's mixed in that has nothing to do with it. You can also do a search for other cases from the Chancery Court that are also digitized. And this is the Chancery Court in Culpeper County, Virginia, although all other counties are also digitized. And you will see some of the same Shackelford. So Sarah McDaniel takes on a couple other people, especially after the death of her husband, Ephraim. He had some debts that had to be paid back. And in the course of doing so, she is quibbling over the use of an enslaved person, which is so problematic and gross. But we'll be getting into those issues more next episode. Also be on the lookout. If you see a John Shackelford in those records, they're probably about the attorney John Shackelford and not Morgan's father, not William Franklin's grandfather. So most of the information in this episode derives from that 1855 court case, except for a few details. The birth dates of John and Elizabeth Shackelford's children, Sarah, Theophilus, Morgan, Caleb, and Francis, come from a family Bible, the scan of which is available on FamilySearch.org. And of course, a link to that is posted in the show notes. The marriage dates of Caty with Martin Button in 1812 and of Francis Shackelford with James McDaniel in 1827 come from the Register of Marriage, Culpeper County, Virginia, 1781 through 1853, which is available online at FamilySearch.org, and the link is posted in the show notes. With that, next time we'll dig into William Franklin Shackelford's family history more broadly in order to put his life into context. Thanks for listening. Email questions or comments to deepdive@hellenaki.com or ask them on the Hellenaki Deep Dive Facebook page. Show notes with links to resources mentioned in this episode are available at hellenaki.com. That's HELONAKI.com. You can also find ways to support the show, now including merch, such as t-shirts, mugs, and stickers with the Hellenaki Deep Dive logo, and you can find those at hellenaki.com/support. My thanks to Patreon supporter at the Geospatial Analyst level, Leah Varel. Your support keeps the Hellenaki Deep Dive going. The Hellenaki Deep Dive is written and produced by me, Jen Globius of the Hellenaki. The theme music is Deep Ocean Instrumental by Dan O of danosongs.com. Additional sounds from zapsplat.com. Thanks for listening.